I'm very proud to chair this session dedicated to music, to Dubois. I will pronounce it in French way, if you will admit it. To Dubois, no, I won't. Bois.
That's the way you want it.
Yeah, you wanted to, yes, I will.
So that's
Dubois' relationship to music. And as most of the black writers, intellectual that can be compared to him, if there are some, namely James Weldon Johnson or Alain Locke, should I pronounce it? In the French way. Du Bois paid a particular attention to the musical achievements of African Americans. As you read The Soul of Black Folk, I've got the French translation here, you cannot help but notice that each chapter begins with two kinds of quotation, two epigraphs, most of them. The one is classically verbal, it's a few verses from English poetry. And the other one is musical. One or two staves taken from a spiritual indeed. This communication suggests that Du Bois treats music the same way than text. That for him, a tune like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot deserves the same dignity than two or three verses from Tennyson or Byron. This is a clear way of introducing the session and to allow us to listen to Travis A.Jackson, who teaches in the Music and Humanities Department, if I say one thing, please, censorship, like at the University of Chicago. He published a few years ago, Blowing the Blues Away, Performance and Meaning in the New York jazz scene, and as well as many other articles, sometimes mostly using the method of coming from ethnomusicology. And he will dedicate his communication, I guess so, to the very last chapter of the Souls of Black Folk, a quite catchy title, Miss, as well as hearing, mishearing or hearing the solo songs.
Okay. Sorry, I'm going to have to do this with two different screens here, but I think we'll be able to make it work. At this point in the colloquium, one might presume that there's little more to be said about W.E.B. Du Bois's work and his influence, particularly where the Souls of Black Folk is concerned. It is a book that, as Brent Hayes Edwards observes in his introduction to the 2007 Oxford edition, comprises, quote, an unusual polyphony of genres: autobiography, history, political criticism, sociology, ethnography, biography, eulogy, fiction, and has had a formative influence on the entire tradition of African American writing that has followed in its wake, end quote. Certain central concepts in the book, the color line, the veil, and the talented tenth, have been singled out for analysis here, and have occasioned some vigorous and enlightening debate. In light of all we have covered, it seems almost banal to note, and it's even more banal given what we just heard, that in the dual epigraphs for each of the book's 14 chapters, Du Bois draws from two disparate sources: writings, mainly from the European poetic tradition, and notated versions of the haunting melodies of spirituals, which he quite reductively glosses as sorrow songs. Quote, the only American music which wells up from black souls in the dark past, end quote. In the first of two biographical volumes on Du Bois, David Levering Lewis explains his subject strategy with the epigraphs. Quote, he twinned the epigraphs in this manner in order to advance the then unprecedented notion that of creative parody and complementarity of white folk and black folk alike. Du Bois meant the cultural symbolism of these double epigraphs to be profoundly subversive of the cultural hierarchy of his time. Until his readers appreciated the message of the songs sung in bondage by black people, Du Bois was saying, words written in freedom by white people would remain hollow and counterfeit, end quote. However compelling one finds Lewis's characterization, Du Bois's choice remains one of the more fascinating aspects of the book. But fascinating is not the same thing as comprehensible. Where Du Bois originally intended to have the The book's substantive chapters conclude with Of the Coming of John. Francis Fisher Brown, the author's editor at A.C. McClurg, prevailed on Du Bois to add the Sorrow Songs chapter, perhaps with the understanding that the gloss on the notated excerpts in the forethought was too brief and left Du Bois's motivations and reasoning too opaque. In the resulting chapter, the only one whose title does not begin with the preposition of, if you scan out table of contents, you notice that, one learns the titles and some of the words of the previously unnamed songs, whose notated versions appear to be taken, with occasional variations or alterations, from two early 1870s printed collections of spirituals. These collections, as was the norm at the time, were produced by educated northern metropolitan whites who, for varying reasons, found themselves among Southern blacks during the Civil War and in the years following its end. Thomas P. Fenner, the music editor of one of the collections, spoke of some of the challenges he and others faced in trying to render the songs they heard for the benefit of those who could not hear them in person. Quote, "There are evidently, I think, two legitimate methods of treating the music, either to render it in its absolute rude simplicity, or to develop it without destroying its original characteristics, the only proper field for such development being in the harmony." End quote. That is a polite way of saying that Fenner had a more activist or prescriptive approach to transcription. In places where he thought, quote, the careful bringing out of the parts might result in an improvement, he altered what he heard. In that sense, he and other music annotators were contributors to a de facto collective project whose ambit was broader than that of the salvage ethnography then sanctioned by the Bureau of American Ethnology. Their seemingly progressive concern was to demonstrate the capacity for New World African descendants and for Native Americans to be civilized. That is, by highlighting the latent harmony, as John Comfort Fillmore put it, that the music of otherwise primitive peoples possessed, these writers hoped to show that such peoples were, musically at least, on their way to being civilized. In the Sorrow Songs chapter, one also learns, somewhat obliquely, that Du Bois's choice of excerpts was motivated by the ways their unstated lyrics might function as commentary on their parent chapter's respective contents. Thus, the melody of I'll Hear That Trumpet Sound follows an excerpt from Elizabeth Barrett Browning's A Romance of the Ganges, an introducing of the coming of John, one of the more challenging and idiosyncratic chapters in the book. Only in the subsequent final chapter might one read the words, "You may bury me in the east, you may bury me in the west, but I'll hear the trumpet sound in that morning." And even there, Du Bois's seeming compromise with his publisher still raises questions. Why remain so oblique? Why presume that his dear readers would be conversant enough with standard Western music notation either to sight sing the excerpts or to play them on an instrument? Would they have available printed collections of spirituals to find the corresponding songs? And even if his readers possessed the requisite skills and materials, what might they have gained from playing items that even their collectors acknowledged corresponded poorly to spirituals as performed in events where words and melodies were inextricable from nuances of timbre, loudness, rhythmic and metric coordination, and of course, movement? I won't begin attempting to answer those questions, but the limited returns Du Bois's readers might have gotten are central to the argument I'm developing here. That argument depends, as well, on another aspect of the final chapter of The Souls of Black Folk. One learns in it of the qualified esteem in which Du Bois held spirituals. That is, although he describes them as both, quote, the most beautiful expression of human experience born this side of the seas, end quote, and, quote, the singular spiritual heritage of the nation and the greatest gift of the Negro people, end quote, he also has much less laudatory things to say about them and the people who produce them. He describes the Gullah populations living around the Sea Islands as, quote, a black folk of primitive type, touched and molded less by the world about them than any others outside the Black Belt. Their appearance was uncouth, their language funny, but their hearts were human and their singing stirred men with a mighty power. End quote. Elsewhere, he describes the song passed to him through his grandfather's grandmother uh, as primitive African music. And he writes that, quote, like all primitive folk, the slave stood near to nature's heart, end quote. It's difficult to escape the impression that with such descriptions as these, Du Bois is doing something more than writing in a manner that might appeal to his white northern metropolitan readers. He might be at the same time expressing his own distance from those who sang spirituals before the Jubilee Singers embarked on their first tour in 1871. Those same people who participated in ritualized moments of creation and recreation before the collectors came, and continued to do so after the collectors left. Those people who evinced little concern for or interest in the sanitized, improved versions the Jubilee Singers and their imitators would perform. And these are, of course, people who captured Du Bois's imagination. Here, passages from Lewis's biography illuminate the romanticized view Du Bois had of Southern African Americans. Especially striking is Lewis's characterization of Du Bois's train journey south to matriculate at Fisk University. Quote, as the train out of New York's Grand Central Terminal dropped below the Mason-Dixon line, past West Virginia and Kentucky, his fascination and excitement mounted at each whistle stop. As speech became slower, skin colors proliferated across the spectrum from alabaster to burnt cork, and the complex etiquette of race relations became increasingly flammable. Willie says nothing about accommodations aboard his train, but segregation in interstate travel was already being imposed. Not unlikely, then, when his future roommate during 3 years at Fisk clambered aboard at Bowling Green, Kentucky, neatly dressed, friendly Otho Porter joined Willie in a Jim Crow car. But if so, this first brush with segregation failed to dampen the exhilaration, the novelty, the sense of predestination Willie felt upon entering the land of slaves and seeing for the first time his crooning great-grandmother's Africa, transplanted and thriving, and bound to him from then on by new and exciting and eternal ties. End quote. The students Du Bois encountered at Fisk came from a variety of backgrounds, many of them from relatively privileged, though not affluent families in their hometowns and cities. And they differed from him in at least one important way, where his own growth and development had been furthered by ever closer contact with Barrington's white community. Their educational and social advancement had largely depended on the extent to which they had been insulated from whites. Depending on how one wants to interpret that datum, Du Bois's fellow students were either less cosmopolitan than him, closer to some essential black way of being, or both. The difference between the worlds they respectively knew, however, was not as vast as the difference between him and the people he encountered in the summers of 1886 and 1887 in Wilson County, immediately east of the center of Nashville's Davidson County. Again, Lewis's description, drawn from Du Bois's writing and from other sources, is apt. Quote, he traveled, all told, no more than 50 miles from Nashville, but measured by the distance from civilization, Willie found himself entering a zone where time had stopped the day after the day of Jubilee. He touched the very shadow of slavery. Wilson County, Tennessee, would remain in his memory bank for a lifetime, influencing a prose to which he was beginning to give a mythic spin, his conception of what he would later call the Black proletariat, and most profoundly, his gestating romantic ideas about African American racial traits. End quote. The way Du Bois presents that understanding of Southern, and especially Southern rural African Americans, was resolutely Herderian. That is, Johann Gottfried Herder's 18th century concept of Volkslied, or folk song, carried with it, quote, concepts of origins, music, language, and culture, and culture itself, and ascribed to folk music the ability to encapsulate and specify cultural identity. The rural Tennesseans of Alexandria and Wilson County were, for Du Bois, the true folk. They were the ones who sang what he would later call sorrow songs. And even though he encountered them as his brothers and sisters in the present, they represented for him, quote, the voices of the past, end quote. Such voices, if they were to be suitable for the kind of project Du Bois undertook in Souls, needed to be presented in forms similar, ironically, to what collectors working before the advent of audio recording in 1877 had given their readers, in a manner that is where meter was regularized, where pitch and intonation were adjusted to conform with the system of equal temperament as well as with major-minor tonality, where timbral differentiation was de-emphasized in favor of abstracted tones ready to be harmonized and improved. Du Bois's vision for the spirituals, then, was one that paralleled other 19th and early 20th century projects of romantic musical nationalism. From the symphonic work of so-called Indianist composers like Edward MacDowell and Arthur Farwell in the United States, to the 8 operas with Czech librettos by Antonín Dvořák. Spirituals, then, were to function for Du Bois, particularly after his time in Tennessee, as another articulation of a particularly bourgeois approach to demonstrating respectability and suitability for full citizenship and recognition. It is far from coincidental that the shape souls took, it is far from coincidental for the shape souls took that the elite African Americans with whom Du Bois increasingly socialized after his first year at Harvard included William Monroe Trotter and Maud Cuney. Trotter was the son of James Monroe Trotter, author of Music and Some Highly Musical People, and an 1878 book that chronicled the lives and works of African American concert or classical musicians, as well as extolled the ennobling effects of formal training in European concert music, especially of the Teutonic variety. The book's account of the Fisk Jubilee Singers features a number of passages, including adjective and adverb choices, that are striking in their similarity to what Du Bois would produce in the Sorrow Songs chapter a quarter century later. For her part, Maud Cuney, better known as Maud Cuney Hare, was a concert pianist, an early participant in the Niagara movement, and the author of the 1936 book Negro Musicians and Their Music, published a month before her death. Whatever ideas Du Bois might have developed about spirituals during his time in Nashville then were reinforced and given a new focus during his time in Cambridge. But there was a disjuncture between what Du Bois heard in his Tennessee summers and the way he represented spirituals in the souls of black folk. A disjuncture one might describe as predicated on a strategic mishearing. The word mishearing is not here a synonym for misapprehension, but instead for a deliberate act of filtering, where the songs, however much their totality might have appealed to Du Bois, were stripped of much that did not serve his aims. That is, the pitched, timbral, dynamic, rhythmic, and movement-based performance nuances that standard Western notation was not devised to accommodate. His romanticized prose, in other words, complemented the collector's notated transformation of spirituals, extracting them not only from ritualized performances, but also from a sound world that was incompatible with the normative aesthetics and standards of European concert music. That characterization is perhaps another form of the complaint offered by the late Sterling Stuckey in the opening chapter of Slave Culture, where he laments how much an approach that one might say was like Du Bois's might have encouraged a radical decontextualization. Stuckey writes, quote, "Too often the spirituals are studied apart from their natural ceremonial context. The tendency has been to treat them as a musical form unrelated to dance, and certainly unrelated to particular configurations of dance and dance rhythm. Abstracted from slave ritual performance, including burial ceremonies, they appear to be under Christian influence to a disproportionate extent." End quote. Some audio examples will help to clarify the kinds of distinctions I'm making, and perhaps that Stuckey might have made. Examples that occupy different positions on a continuum and that, arrayed from one side to the other, feature Sea Island-style ring shouts, Southern African American congregational worship, spirituals produced for the concert hall, and because these are not audio examples, we won't hear them, notated versions of such material as provided by Du Bois and Souls of Black Folk. So in the first of the audio examples, one hears the McIntosh County Shouters performing Sign of the Judgment. The recording features many of the practices that commentators like Ollie Wilson, Eileen Southern, and Samuel A. Floyd Jr. have identified as recurrent in African diaspora musical forms. Among them are overlapping call and response patterning, emphasis on offbeat melodic accents, a preference for noisy and heterogeneous rather than blended timbres, an emphasis on percussive treatment of voices and instruments, and cyclical organization. So there's a lot of stuff, but I guarantee you hear all of it.
I see the sign. Yeah. I see the sign. Yeah. I see the sign. Yeah. Lord, time's going now. This sign of the judgment. Yeah. This sign of the judgment. Yeah. This sign of the judgment. Yeah. Lord, time's going now. God in the victory. Yeah. God in the victory. Yeah. God in the victory. Yeah. Lord, time's going now. Who's crossing the valley? Yeah. Who's crossing?
The second example features the Blue Spring Missionary Baptist Association delegation, big name, performing Sit Down Servant, a tune that has the kind of open-ended structure prominent in 19th century transcriptions of slave songs. It has less pronounced percussive rhythms and offbeat accents than Sign of the Judgment, but it otherwise draws from the same sonic repertoire. Note that the leader's calls change in successive cycles of the tune, while the responses remain the same.
Oh, sit down, servant. Oh, sit down, servant. Oh, sit down, servant. Sit down. Sit down. I know you're tired. I know you're tired. And I know you're tired. Sit down. Sit down. Where you come from along.
The third example, a lined hymn titled A Charge to Keep I Have, comes from the same ensemble, and it sits in a structurally and rhythmically more amorphous place, one where the seemingly unsynchronized improvised singing of the congregants in response to the leader nonetheless provides evidence of deep knowledge of the performance style and sensitive attention to the performances of other singers. At the beginning, note that the leader recites all the lines of the song rapidly, though their presentation will in fact be more gradual.
And this short meter hymn, a charge to keep our have, a God to glorify, a never dying soul to save, and fitted for the sky, a
These three examples feature performers orally trained in African American churches and thus conversant with their specific repertories and performance practices. The fourth through sixth examples, in contrast, present recordings ever closer to a concert music ideal, an ideal in which performers are formally trained, often using standard Western music notation, to value other aspects of repertory and performance practice. The fourth example, then, a Fisk Jubilee Quartet recording of Little David Play on Your Harp from 1909, uses only voices, as did the previous example, but the singer's lively presentation is more rehearsed. It's more rehearsed. produce less in the moment than for the moment. In the place of call and response, open-ended organization, there's a more determined emphasis on letting the details and execution of the arrangement carry the song. In other words, listeners might be slightly more primed here to attend to diction and a specific kind of precision than they might have been with the preceding recording.
Little David, play on your harp, hallelujah, hallelujah. David, play on your harp, hallelujah. David, play on your harp, hallelujah, hallelujah. David, play on your harp, hallelujah. Little David was a shepherd boy. He killed Goliath and shouted for joy. Little David, play on your harp, hallelujah, hallelujah. David, play on your harp, hallelujah. David, play on your harp, hallelujah, hallelujah. David, play on your harp, hallelujah.
The fifth example takes auditors more deeply into the concert music world, for it features only one voice, with all other possible vocal or instrumental roles fulfilled by a pianist. Here, then, we hear Paul Robeson in a May 1958 concert at Carnegie Hall.
Oh, yeah.
Performing Balm in Gilead. He is accompanied by pianist Alan Booth on an arrangement by Harry T. Burley. The piano introduction and occasional departures from strict metronomic time recall less the openness of African American ring shouts or congregational singing than they do performances of 19th century German lieder.
There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. Sometimes I feel discouraged and think my work's in vain.
The final example also comes from the concert music world. The year is 1961, and like the previous example, this recording features a solo singer accompanied by a pianist. In this case, Marian Anderson and Franz Rupp, respectively, performing an arrangement of Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child, the arrangement written by Lawrence Brown, Paul Robeson's longtime accompanist. I could characterize this recording in terms similar to those for the Robeson example, adding only that Anderson's diction is even more precise, specifically calibrated to ensure the intelligibility of the lyrics.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. A long ways from home. A long
The movement from the kinetic multi-sensory experience at one end of that continuum to the silent visual one at the other end is not only made possible by what I've called mishearing, but also encouraging of further mishearing. And part of what I'm gesturing toward there is that in too many instances, it seems that writers who invoke the discourse of the sorrow songs, especially writers of a literary bent, have done little more than read Du Bois. And they are unaware of the limitations of his project or the lengthy debates that historians and musicologists have separately had about the provenance and interpretation of spirituals. Most egregiously, I'm thinking of two relatively recent articles that rely on the sorrow in Du Bois's chapter title to understand spirituals only as a response to trauma, and then uses that conceit to talk about other things. Of course, the maintenance of practices predating the slave trade and spirituals, as well as in other African diasporic musics, makes an argument like that much less tenable. And thinking about some other misuses, perhaps, of the idea, in potentially worse situations, one might mishear spirituals performed in ways indistinguishable from the concert music repertory, as at once indexing the universality and power of European concert music, and supporting the notion that blacks can exhibit sophistication only when their outlooks and regimes of value resemble those of Europeans. I recognize that some of you might find that reading too harsh, and so be it. It emerges from my, as an ethnomusicologist, having an abiding interest in how the mechanics of music making articulate with other domains of experience. It emerges even more, though, from my class and regional difference from Du Bois. I grew up barely middle class in Nashville and spent my childhood attending a church located at 2021 Herman Street, just out of view to the right in a photograph I hastily snapped last March before driving back to Chicago following a Sunday afternoon funeral. So bear in mind, I took this photo when I was at home in March, not knowing about this event. The overpass that one sees in the distance there is a renamed stretch of Dr. D.B. Todd Boulevard. That street, which continues out on the left side of the image, just out of sight, forms the western boundary of the Fisk University campus. And the overpass is now known as the Jubilee Singers Bridge. So you get in a little bit closer and you will now see why I took the photograph. Or you might see more clearly why I took the photograph. I took the photograph because of the image of Du Bois painted on a wall and illuminated by the fading sun. So you can see it right over that red vehicle there. The image is resonant for me because it indexes the ways in which Du Bois's presentation of the sorrow songs, and even George L. White's work with the original Jubilee Singers, rested in my childhood at such a remove from what I experienced in a church only a few blocks away. The sorrow songs, as Du Bois encourages his readers to mishear them, sound almost nothing like the first examples I played, which are presumably similar in terms of practice to what he heard more than a century ago. His mishearings beget other mishearings, such that I can't hear the sorrow songs with him. He keeps me and listeners like me at a distance. And with that in mind, I'll close a bit archly with one of my favorite non-congregational, non-concert hall renderings of a spiritual. This is a group led by the guitarist Grant Green on a 1963 Blue Note recording, and they're performing Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child. So you'll hear the opening thematic statement, followed by a fade out, and things will come back up at the end of Grant Green's solo, and then you'll hear the beginning of Herbie Hancock's solo, and that's what I really want you to pay attention to right here.
Mhm.